Welcome to Viewpoint on ILTV, where we bring you leading voices in the Middle East and beyond. In this special, we're taking you inside the Israel-Gaza war to hear from stakeholders, thought leaders, and decision makers. I'm Emily Schrader, and today we're speaking with renowned author and activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali. While in Europe, Ayaan sat down with us to discuss the events of October 7th, the threat of Islamist terror groups, and the future of the West. Ayaan Hirsi Ali here in the UK with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to start by asking you what your experience was growing up. How were you taught to view Jews and to view Israel and to view this Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I mean, you have been a fierce defender of Western liberal values for much of your life, but what were you taught?
So I got here, I'll say I've come to my views through a combination of experience and schooling. So in my life experience, I grew up in a Muslim household. I come from a Muslim country. Somalia is almost 98% Muslim. Everybody who's not a Muslim in Somalia hides the fact that they are not Muslim. And so that gives you an idea of where I come from. And then my family moved from Somalia to Saudi Arabia. We moved to Ethiopia, and eventually we settled in Kenya for about a decade. My father came and married me off to a man of his choice, not my choice. And I managed to escape all of that. I came to the Netherlands in 1992. That for me was the access point into Western civilization. That's the country that allowed me to stay, that gave me shelter, gave me food. And then comes the second part, the schooling. I went to the University of Leiden, and it was there that I was able to compare and say, my childhood was spent in the third world, where there is anarchy and where there's tyranny, where there's poverty, where there's misogyny, where we had all of these problems, and to a certain degree, normal, ordinary people had accepted it as a fact of life. And so when I came to the Netherlands, again, access point into Western society, I was mesmerized, and still am to a certain degree, by this fantastic balance between order and liberty. And I have been enjoying that since, except unfortunately now, we are seeing this crumbling into disorder, and sometimes it amazes me, but some people actually desiring tyranny over liberty. And so here's where we are now. So how did I come to understand the conflict between Hamas in my eyes and Israel? Growing up, again, as a Muslim, as you know, this conflict has been going on over nearly 75 years or 75 years. I am 54 years old, and so growing up, I learned, there were these demons, these monstrous creatures called Jews. And Jews are evil. They have rebelled against God. They are basically a synonym for Satan. And they have a goal, an objective, and their objective is to cause corruption and to destroy Muslims. And so these poor Palestinians, these poor Arabs, they are victims of these terrible, monstrous power that represents evil. And so all of us as Muslims, we have to join hands and stand with the Palestinians, stand with the Arabs, and try to reclaim this land called Israel, which is really not Israel, it's a Muslim land. We have to reclaim the whole, all of it, from these terrible Jews. And it's not only me as a Somali who's taught this, but later on as I grew up, I realized all Muslims somewhere were being taught this. And the money for propagating that, yes, propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda, the Islamist-driven anti-Semitic propaganda, that money was coming from Gulf countries. It was coming from Saudi Arabia. And early, the UAE stopped recently But in the 80s, in the 90s, it was also coming from the UAE, it was coming from Kuwait, it was coming from Iran, it was coming from the Gulf. And instead of spending these monies on developing their own societies and modernizing and facing up to the challenges of what we call modernity, they were basically using it as a propaganda tool to say that Israel and the Jewish people are responsible for their problems.
Now, why do you think that there is so much animosity towards Jews and towards Israel in the Muslim world, in the Middle East, but of course, also as we're seeing more recently, Muslims in the Western world as well?
If you want to understand that and you want to really find an answer to that question, which I think is an all-important question, you have to understand the four-letter word dawah. D-A-W-A, which is the missionary work. It can be translated into English as missionary, but it's a combination of missionary work. It is raising money from charities. It is seeding organizations, front organizations, but also propaganda organizations all across the world. It's taking over existing Quran schools. When I went, and I was a little girl, I went to what was called a Quran school. Maybe you could describe that as sort of a daycare center where you learned to read the Quran. But that was hijacked by people who came in with more money, and it was then turned into these hate centers where young children as young as 3 years old, 4 years old and above are indoctrinated with this hatred. Now, right next to you, Hamas is doing it in Gaza, and they're doing it in the West Bank, and that is much, much more intense. I think you're more familiar with that. But imagine that happening in Afghanistan, in Indonesia, in Somalia, in all these far-flung places, and of course here in the West, because the West, because of freedom of religion, because of freedom of association, because of freedom of speech, people, Islamist activists, who are trying to overthrow governments in the Middle East, they fled and they came here. They came here to different parts of Europe, they came here to the United States of America, and they started to establish themselves as entities, as organizations, early on saying, oh, we are just a voice for the Muslim people, or we are a voice for the Palestinians, or we are a voice, presenting themselves in this garb of charity and justice. And meanwhile, they had this subversive idea of saying, oh, not only do we want to destroy Israel, we actually also want to take over Western nations. That's their objective.
Now, this is one of the things we have seen here in the UK with the Islamic Republic of Iran. They have poured quite a bit of money into all of Europe, really. The Islamic centers that they have funded that it turns out are really just fronts for the regime. You mentioned that previously the UAE and some of the Gulf countries had done a lot of this funding of these more extremist elements, even in the West. I'm wondering how that has shifted sort of from the more Sunni Gulf countries to the Shia Islamic Republic of Iran, and if that's worse or better, or what your take is on the role of Iran in this on this issue.
So I think the shift, occurred. I have noticed the shift right after ISIS came up. Let's call it the rise and fall of ISIS. I think that is when countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Morocco, all of these countries, I think their younger generation of rulers realized that's not what we want. And I think they also realized that by funding these types of extremisms, it doesn't stay in Afghanistan and it doesn't stay in Somalia. It doesn't stay in Europe. It comes right back at them. And so from that rightly understood self-interest, I think they stopped not only funding them, but started also, say, banning the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is banned in the UAE. It's banned in Saudi Arabia. Now, I do not know to what extent individual wealthy Saudis fund or do not fund extremist organizations. I don't have any overview of that, but I think as a matter of government policy, the Saudis and the Emiratis have stopped funding it. Qatar has not stopped doing that, and so there is still a great deal of Sunni extremism that is spread with funding and support from Qatar, from Turkey, and so on. And then you obviously come to Iran, and here's what I think of the Islamist Republic of Iran. They took control in 1979 and they came to power promising to overthrow the corrupt, un-Islamic Shah, who was under, they said, the spell of the Jews and the Americans. So instead of establishing a tranquil utopia as they promised, what they did was, first of all those far left groups who were Marxists or Trotskyists who supported them, they got rid of them. They exiled them, they jailed them, they killed them, they did away with them. And then they didn't deliver the promised goods, which was liberty and order and all sorts of good stuff that they promised. They didn't deliver on that. The other objective was to destroy, to be the Islamist power that takes out Israel. And they remain dedicated to that objective. So we had, from the Iranian embassy in Kenya in the 1980s, establishing madrasas and giving money to poor Africans and march in the streets to hate Israel, to hate America. I was in 1989, I was in Kenya when I was burning Salman Rushdie's book. So the Irani influence was far-reaching. And yes, it is in America, it is in Europe, more so because we're open societies. But here's what the result is. Iran, since 1979, has not delivered. It has alienated its own population. The people who hate the Islamist regime of Iran are Iranians. That's their population. And beyond, all they have done is export this, through dawah, these terrorism. They've spent, I think, just unimaginable amounts of money and resources on developing this nuclear weapon to destroy Israel. They're completely obsessed with destroying Israel. They're backing Hamas. They're backing the Houthis. They're backing Hezbollah. Hezbollah is basically an arm of Iran. Yeah, why are they doing this? Why is this regime so obsessed with doing this? And they think from an ideological perspective, the reason that they're committed to it is, I think they religiously believe that that is what their calling is.
It's madness. It's really madness.
To you and me, it is madness, but it is adaptive, rational madness. That's where the paradox lies. With every new technology that comes, they adapt, whether it is social media, so they can amplify their propaganda. They've never had more support than ever before with the most modern cutting-edge technology. They're going to start using AI, if they don't already use it, to propagate their poison. But they're also trying to get drones or have drones. They're trying to get a nuclear weapon, all for that same hateful, destructive, backward-looking cause. And that is, I think, what most Westerners are struggling to understand. How can they be so modern? How can they be using modern tools to pursue a goal that is so destructive, so hateful, and so backward-looking?
Now, you are originally from Somalia, and there is another woman, a Somalian woman, a member of Congress in the United States, who I believe you're familiar with, not on a personal level, but Ilhan Omar, who has been quite active against the state of Israel. She's even made quite a few anti-Semitic comments, and of course has opposed sanctions on Iran, opposed sanctions on Venezuela. What is your response to some of these controversial views of Ilhan Omar?
So I do not know Congresswoman Ilhan Omar in person. I'm like you and like many other people watching her and speculating from afar. And part of me thinks, okay, so this little girl who is a refugee from Somalia and fled the war comes to the United States of America. And right now, I mean, when she came, I would say, heavens, that was the country that won the Cold War. By the way, that was the country that also won the Second World War. And so here she is from Somalia. She should be thinking, I've got this amazing opportunity. Look what this country has done for me. What am I going to do in return? And so part of me thinks, okay, she has made a choice that's different from mine. That happens. Part of me also thinks that she, like many other young people, are victims of this existing subversive woke indoctrination that's already present in America. So imagine if a little girl from Somalia who comes to Minnesota can go woke. What do you think of the little Minnesotans growing up in Minnesota? So I think part of it is, okay, she made a personal choice. She's an adult now, and she's responsible for her personal choices. She's responsible for her behavior, and that's the ideological path she took. It has consequences. But I think part of it is we as a Western society, we as America, we are to blame. Our schools, our media. How is it possible that we're bringing people? She was rescued as a refugee. She's rescued from these terrible camps. How is it that we bring people to our own shores only for them to turn into socialists and Marxists? What the hell are we doing wrong?
Now, what was your experience on October 7th? Obviously, you weren't in Israel, but when did you hear about it and what was your initial reaction?
I was traveling. I was in the UK, and my initial thoughts were, it's shocking, it's horrific, and it promises to be more horrific. But then here we go again. It wasn't surprising. And I think that is probably the way most Israelis reacted. I think most people who follow what goes on in the Middle East, and in particular this entity called Hamas, this evil entity called Hamas, were shocked at what they did because they upwon themselves on barbarism. It's even more gruesome, even more horrific, the things that they have done. And in that sense, shocking, because you think how brutal can human beings become? But was it surprising? The whole entity called Hamas, they read their charter. It is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. So that's their daily job. And when they are sleeping at night, that's what they think about, what they dream about, what they raise money for. And here's what's so appalling. They raise their children, babies. They raise them in this objective. So the children and the women, the civilians, are simply tools to serve in this objective that is hatred. And so that is what I mean by surprise. If Hamas, you have a ceasefire now, they give back the number of hostages that they have. The world pushes Israel into a ceasefire that I don't think Israel should have. They will go, they will regroup, they will rest, they'll raise more money, they'll raise more children in hatred in those madrasas that they have established, paid for by the United Nations and other international actors, countries that feel sorry for the Palestinian people and for the Palestinian cause. And that money is going to be used to redo October 7 in a way that will shock us even more when it happens.
Now, do you think that the Western world, namely the United States and Europe, are doing enough to deal with the threat of Islamists? And if not, what can they do in order to push back without, violating their own values and their own principles of liberalism?
I think what you're seeing now is, take France, for instance. France has been the victim of multiple terrorist attacks. And they got to a point where they had to cast aside all the liberal principles and adopt a state of emergency just to cope with it. France has come out of that state of emergency. But I think the problem is growing to such proportions now that you are going to start to see more European countries, and God forbid, even America, consider these emergency actions. And as a person, I think I know what emergency actions are. Some of these are tyrannical policies that are supposed to be put in place temporarily, and then we go back to our liberal way of life. We've had a taste of it during the COVID years. I don't think that is the path we should go, but I do really think we should have to start drawing red lines. And we have to say, this is who we are. Restore our institutions. The threat to the West is not only coming from the Islamists. The Islamist threat is a very serious threat because it's in our soil. There are large populations of Islamists on our soil who are and have been targeting Muslim populations, but now increasingly in America, even non-Muslim populations. Through da'wah, hundreds of thousands of Hispanics and African Americans have been converted to Islam. And they haven't been converted to my grandmother's Islam. They've been converted to the Muslim Brotherhood type of Islam, radical Islam. And so this is going on, and I think it is time that we have to restore our institutions and regain that confidence in what makes Western society unique and the envy of all its enemies. We're under attack from China, we're under attack from Russia, and of course the Islamist threat. And I think the longer we wait, the more serious our problems get.
Now, after October 7th, we've actually seen a massive increase in anti-Semitism globally, which in a way you would think would be the opposite after October 7th, given that it was the largest number of Jews who have been killed since the Holocaust. Why are we seeing this in the streets of Europe and in the United States, on campuses? Why are we seeing this rise in anti-Semitism in response to a massacre of Jews?
It's the Islamist-driven anti-Semitism, and it's driven through da'wah. And I have been trying for years to get my colleagues in academia, in politics, in media, to understand the term da'wah and its implications, and it's been ignored. Everyone I talk to about anti-Semitism would rather talk about far-right anti-Semitism. And the far-right anti-Semitism is a problem, but it is of a much smaller magnitude. There is the unholy alliance of the Islamist-driven anti-Semitism and the far-left anti-Semitism. And we are contending with the problem of far-leftism because they really are the subversive entities that are trying to take us back to communism and socialism. They idolize socialism, they idolize communism. And so now you have this alliance, and the woke narrative, the woke takeover of our institutions through diversity, equity, and inclusion, they enable and empower the Islamists in their advance of anti-Semitism. They make anti-Semitism okay again. They make anti-Semitism even glamorous in some circles. And they use this combination of playing the victim and using whatever they choose out of the woke lexicon to help them advance their agenda. They have infiltrated the major parties, the major center-left parties of all Western countries. The Democratic Party in the United States, the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, the Social Democrats and the Greens in places like the Netherlands, Germany. And so, and I'm saying this combination of the woke and the Islamists, so their narrative, they don't have to have power. They don't have to say, oh, we have, the Prime Minister is a radical Muslim. They don't need that. They're achieving way more by staying out of office while taking over these institutions. And I think you have to understand, you have to take the time to understand da'wah and how da'wah drives this particular type of anti-Semitism that we're seeing now.
Now, you spoke a little bit about the use of the woke lexicon. I'm wondering what your response is, as an academic yourself, to these buzzwords that we hear being used in reference to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the accusations of genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing. Of course, these words have actual definitions that don't apply to the situation on the ground, and yet they continue to be used to drum up animosity towards Israel. What is your response to the abuse of these terms, this language?
It is happening because our society is being subverted. We are being told that Marxism, communism, socialism is the alternative to everything we believe in. And I'm sure this process of subversion started during the Cold War, and it's been going on, and I think we've been blind to it. I'll speak for myself. I was blind to it. I thought communism was defeated in America. I thought communism was defeated and rejected in Europe and was never going to make a return. I also thought people would be looking at areas like Venezuela and other places where people still seem to believe, oh, if we try it one more time, if we try it differently, it's going to be fine. So I thought it was gone, it was done, and these were young people in university, and you know how young people are. They'll grow out of it. That's not what's happening. I think what we're seeing is that this subversion that started way back in the 60s, 70s, 80s has been successful from the viewpoint, from the perspective of the Marxists. Very, very successful. And they've introduced, of course, part of how to get, Gramsci, I don't know if you've ever had him, but the march through the institutions is the subversion of culture. And you can't subvert culture unless you subvert language. And so we are seeing this as part of this Marxist agenda, again, that's enabling the Islamists to hop on and use it in their own way. Because when the Islamists say Israel is committing genocide, they mean they want to commit genocide, because what they want everyone to agree, and I think they're getting somewhere, just looking at what the output is of the United Nations, is if Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians, surely it is justified to commit genocide against them. That's where things are going. And I think that is why it is not enough to just use the hard tools of the military and surveillance powers. I think it's time that Israel gets into the game of public relations and propaganda. It's time that Israel as a country invests more in propagating the truth.
What does that look like? What are practical things that you could suggest that would be done? Would you advise censoring some of social media? Would you advise putting forward more media that's state-run but from the West? What can actually be done?
I don't believe in censorship. I think all that censorship does is empowers those people, because they have a black market anyway of having these terrible ideas be transmitted, and the ideas, if they're censored, they can't be tested. And so censorship is really a bad policy. It is always, you fight censorship with the truth by amplifying it. But I think you have to take a pause and understand what da'wah means in all its entirety. And once you understand that, mount a counter da'wah. And that is, I think, what's been missing from this game. There is the subversion that's coming from this Putin and his ilk, the subversion that is coming from the CCP, and of course the Islamists. And what we failed, we're now grasping and saying disinformation, misinformation, disinformation, but this is sort of running after the problem. And some of the people who grasp this problem and think, okay, we're under attack, there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation going on, I think their response is to say censorship, which is the wrong way to go about it. It's also to focus, sometimes obsessively, on one election, one referendum, one leader. And when you do that, you miss the big picture. And I think you have to go back to the big picture. That is the drawing table, that is understand the fundamentals of subversion. Who is doing the subverting? What are their objectives? What have they achieved so far? How can we roll this back? We have to ask ourselves all of these questions, but we never take the time, because in the US, our attention span is all of the next 2 years, the congressional elections and then the presidential elections. And that's our time horizon, and that's killing us.
And finally, our last question for today. I wanted to ask you what your vision is of the future, and is it possible that we can avoid this sort of civilizational clash?
We are in the middle of a civilizational clash, so we can't avoid that. I'll tell you what our strength is. Our strength is our ideas, our values, our foundational principles, and the institutions that we built. Those are our strengths. Our people are also our strength. And our people are heterogeneous because they're not only one tribe or one religious group. America is just the planet, pretty much. And there are so many of those people, many of them immigrants like me, who love these values and foundational principles. We also have the concept of the free market, which I think we still take seriously up to a point. And I think if you look at our strengths and you look at the threats we face, all that is missing there is for us to come together, see the big picture, fight this thing now, while we can still fight it. Restore. I've just started a project called the Restoration Project. I'm launching on the 2nd of April on Substack. And that is the point. The point is to say, let's look at what's broken and let's restore that. And that, I think, is the way ahead. I know militarily we're superior. Economically, we're superior. And when it comes to developing a ministry of counter tricks, we can do that too. We've done it during the Cold War. We can do it. We just need to regain the confidence in ourselves. And I think what has happened so far successfully for them is that our guilt has been weaponized. The West's success has been weaponized against itself. Westerners have been told you're white and you're privileged. And I think we should never have accepted that, but we can climb out of that. We have to put a stop to feeling this guilt. We have to put a stop to all these stupid sessions of unconscious bias training. We have to acknowledge that the privilege we have is the outcome of centuries of hard work. And it is the outcome of the right principles. That is why that combination of freedom of religion and speech, combined with a free market, combined with freedoms, protected freedoms for citizens, that is why it works in America as much as it works in South Korea, as much as it works in Israel. It's these principles, not the color of people's skin. And so we have to start to see what is right about us and the privileges that we have and actually cherish them and restore them.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you very much for being in this fight too.